Oh, thank you so much. I'm Dave Owens. I'm president of Indiana's, I'm the Indiana chapter president for the TRA. And I see some of our other folks sprinkled around. I don't know who's online, but Margaret Griffin down there is our secretary. And I'm not seeing the others yet, but they'll come along. We are so excited about this. It's been moved once or twice by uprisings and COVID. And Mr. Zacks has just been wonderful in trying to make it happen. I'm going to give Liz a few minutes of instruction, and I'm going to come back and give you an introduction to Mr. Zacks, and then we'll let him take the floor. So Liz, what do you want for? She's our Zoom master.
Well, welcome, and we're glad you could join us tonight. And just a little bit about Zoom, if you have any questions. You are on the screen right now, so keep that in mind. Sometimes people get real comfortable while they're on the screen, so you don't want to do this. Is the island of vice, but we don't want any vice to happen tonight, okay? So please go turn your camera off if and we just see your name. That's fine, okay? You don't need to be on camera. Also, make sure your sound's off because we want to have good, clear sound from Richard Zacks and hear what he's saying to us. If you have questions, at the bottom of the screen is a little icon for chat. If you will click on the chat, and if you will send a message to everyone or to me specifically if you have any questions, and I will keep track of all those questions. And after our presentation, we will ask. The cat has just appeared behind my head. Sorry, that's pretty interesting looking, like my hair's growing. We got to remove the cat. Uh, put your questions in the chat, and after the presentation, I'm sure Mr. Zacks will be more than willing to answer those. Okay? This is an adult conversation. I just want to remind you of that. Our last great meeting was a children's topic, so you want to make sure that anybody in your listening or viewing range is of appropriate age. I'm done. Thank you.
Liz is my sister, and she's been wonderful with technology, and she's great with teaching and stuff like that. We are so honored to have Richard Zacks here tonight. How this started out is in Indiana, we have every year we have a different promotion, and this year is our Year of Police Award. And so we've given 3 of them now, and we're working on a 4th one, and we have some law enforcement people involved and things. And so just the simpleton's approach, I Googled in December or January, Theodore Roosevelt Police Commissioner. And up pops Richard Zacks and Island of Ice. And I think it's been a tremendous read. I bet you do too. So I'm going to let him introduce himself. We're so pleased he's here and so pleased with his patience in rescheduling this a time or two. We'll turn it over to Richard Zacks and we'll go from there. Thank you, Mr. Zacks.
Okay. Hi, can everybody hear me or yeah? Sound good? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm Richard Zacks. Okay, I like the thumb up, Tim Glover. I'm Richard Zacks. I've written 6 narrative history books, and one of them was on Teddy Roosevelt as police commissioner. And I'm going to do a PowerPoint. So I hope you guys, once I click on share screen, I hope you guys will pin that or have that in the middle, because I love these images. Some of these are just the most wonderful vintage photographs from the 1890s and from the old newspapers. So I guess I'll just get right to it. I mean, I have written other books if you want to, if there are other, Mark Twain, Chasing the Last Laugh. We're working on trying to make that into a TV series right now. And anyhow, that's the story. And I hope you enjoy this topic. It is R-rated. It's there will be some nudes and there will be some topics of that sort. But anyhow, here we go. As most of you no doubt know, oh no, how do I advance the slides? Hold on, sorry. As most of you no doubt know, Teddy Roosevelt was extremely energetic, stubborn, opinionated, and supremely confident. His own Uncle Robert said that if Theodore ever encounters a stone wall, he will bang his head against it till he knocks it down. His niece recalled playing a game at Oyster Bay that involved walking a straight line, even if it meant climbing over the barn. His own uncle. So a police scandal hits New York, and the reformers elect a mayor who appoints Roosevelt as police commissioner in May 1895. And TR admits that he knows nothing about police administration. He's 36 years old. He's coming off 6 years at the Civil Service Commissioner in DC, which was not exactly the limelight. And he even wrote, he said at one point he feared he might have to spend his life writing books. And all I can say is God help him. He did write 37 in his spare time. But so Roosevelt is a strict law and order Republican and a holier than thou municipal reformer. And he hated racy entertainment such as striptease shows. He hated drunkenness. He expected men to be virgins on their wedding night. And this is the man that wants to wipe out vice and corruption in New York City. I mean, which was one of the most corrupt, lewd, drunken, debauched cities in the world. Most of the New Yorkers thought he was joking. Within 3 months of his appointment, this is how a major newspaper portrayed Roosevelt on the front page. Because police commissioners for decades had talked about enforcing all the laws and all the police conduct rules, but nobody really thought about doing it. It was almost the premise for a sitcom or a dark comedy. Toss one uncompromising Harvard-educated reformer into the brothels and gambling joints of Gotham, stir slightly with Irish cops, and wait for the explosion. So to understand Roosevelt, we're talking 1895 here, you need to understand New York City. This is Times Square. It was called Longacre Square back then. I just love this photograph. No traffic lights, no stop signs. Vehicles could ride in any direction, up and down. Thieves stole more horses in New York City than in the entire state of Texas. And then they raced to outlaw stables to have the horses dyed a different color and the tails bobbed. I mean, it was basically like chop shops for horses and wagons back in the 1890s. And I love this. Look at the sanitation guy in the middle of that photograph. There were 60,000 horses in New York back then, and they produced about 30 pounds of manure each. So you're looking at 1.8 million pounds of horse manure every day in New York City. So New York was crowded, it was noisy, it was fast paced. It had a population around 2 million. And the majority of New Yorkers were actually foreign born. The city housed more Irish than Dublin, more Germans than any city but Berlin. And the spirit of the place was defiantly international. Tammany Hall, a Democratic political club, dominated, had won 7 of the last 9 elections. And Tammany's arch enemies were reformers and Republicans. And TR, of course, was a reformer and a Republican. So Tammany Hall was unapologetically corrupt. And they had a swagger about it. A Tammany contractor was hired to deliver 1,000 pounds of sponges to the sanitation department. He was accused of delivering only 1/10 that amount, about 100 pounds. And when asked about it, he replied under oath, "Hell, did you weigh them dry?" So New York was fractured along class lines. This is near Fifth Avenue, near where the Plaza Hotel is today. The so-called robber barons of railroad, coal, and steel amassed huge fortunes in the days of the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Astors, and of course, J.P. Morgan. I love this photo too. Morgan hated to be photographed. Part of it was because of his nose. He did not like people to get images of his nose. And cartoonists portrayed it as generally as a Zeppelin or a hot air balloon in cartoons. The flip side of New York City was unimaginable poverty. I mean, we talk about the Gilded Age. You just can't imagine what it was like after the Panic of 1893. High unemployment, starvation wages, vagrants sent to the workhouse. And this is Police Lodging House. Basically the basement of most precincts. I know there's some law enforcement officers out there. The basement of most precincts had a lodging house, which was the last desperate place for people. And this was a handful of them were dedicated to women only. This was a women's lodging house. And what they did was they slept on planks on the floor. And in the morning, the cops would come in and yell at them to make the bed. And that meant turning the plank over. And the cops used to fumigate the place by smoking cigars a lot. I mean, the woman does look a little drunk there in the center of that photograph. And then you have to get a sense of I mean, this isn't a photograph to capture that, but how dominant New York was back then. New York was the nation's financial capital, Wall Street, the nation's leading commercial port. There still was a port, 144 piers. The dominant manufacturing center had 12,000 factories and 500,000 factory workers. Arts capital, nation's premier resident was Fifth Avenue, but it also was the vice capital of New York, dangling more opportunities for prostitution, gambling, and all-night drinking than any other city. I promise I will get to Roosevelt, but you have to get a sense of just how unbelievably idealistic and quixotic it was what he intended to do to really the most corrupt city in America. I mean, there were 40,000 prostitutes working in New York, some in brothels, some on the streets. There were illegal casinos, bookie joints, all-night dance halls. This was the Tammany town that high-strung Teddy Roosevelt was going to clean up. I mean, visitors could immediately sense the wicked possibilities. If you look way up the top there, this is Diana. This was on top of Madison Square Garden. New York had a nude weather vane at 340 feet, and it was the second famous statue, famous photograph, all the push carts. It's famous for that, but not many people talk about all the cheap brothels that were there. There were 150 discount disorderly houses all over the neighborhood, but they were also at 6, 8, 10, 12, and 14 Delancey Street, which is one of the most famous streets for push carts. And what was interesting to me is I was doing a walking tour for NPR, and I had heard this story that 81 Eldridge Street brothel, on the backside of it was a synagogue, Beth Israel on Chipolan. And the congregants sometimes complained that their chanting was interrupted by rhythmic, exuberant sounds of a very different character. So I was walking around with NPR that day, and we were looking for the address. We found the address of what had been the brothel. We walked around the corner to Forsyth, and on what was now an apartment building was a fire escape that still had Jewish stars on it from when it had been that synagogue. And just the idea that New York hasn't changed, that place that once complained about a brothel that was once a synagogue was still there. I don't know, I found that pretty amazing. So the second major brothel district of the city was in the 1890s, was just south of Washington Square. And it's basically the modern day campus of NYU. And it was the French brothel district. Brothel district was called the Tenderloin. It stretched from 23rd to 42nd Street, engulfing a 2-block wide swath on either side of Broadway. It's high energy, gaudy, featured hotels, dance houses, gambling casinos. Bribe-taking police captain Clubber Williams said he'd been living on rump steak until his transfer there and was now excited to taste some tenderloin. And the name stuck for half a century. It's not, New Yorkers don't use that term anymore. It had dance halls such as the Haymarket, which is in this painting here, Star and Gardner. And these places stayed open past the 1 a.m. curfew. Beside the lure of sex and drinking, Manhattan offered extensive opportunities to gamble. And again, I love this photograph. This is a photograph of a gambling raid. New Yorkers placed illegal racetrack bets at places called pool rooms. And these had nothing to do with billiards. They were betting pool rooms, usually hidden over a bar or in a hotel. The results came in generally by telegraph ticker, and the manager read them aloud, such as blonde in a motel is closing on the outside, vixen is gaining fast at the clubhouse turn, just to create some excitement for the people that were attending. And I guess Ronald Reagan was the announcer off the telegraph for a while, not for illegal places, but he did that kind of sports reporting. The gambling at, say, Canfield's on West 26th Street was more refined with champagne, chandeliers, ivory chips. Richard Canfield had the bright idea of allowing the wealthy to have IOUs, and that allowed them to lose a lot more money. Now, the key point here is that all this illegal gambling, illegal prostitution could not exist without the look the other way connivance of the New York police force. It just was not possible. So I'm not saying, please, I'm not saying that every police officer was corrupt, but there was a different attitude back then. It was basically that it was okay to take some bribes and to overlook vice, since most New Yorkers and most tourists clearly wanted vice. A veteran detective summed it up. Of course, there are cops who have never taken $1. At least I heard about them, but I never saw one. However, if they exist, I give them credit for being so good or for being on bum posts. So cops took bribes to cover all aspects of New York life. Bribes to let push carts stay in the place longer than the 10 minutes allowed by law. They took bribes to allow overnight wagon parking. They let fruit stores keep their crates on the street, let saloons stay open past 1 a.m. One saloon claimed not to have closed its doors since the Civil War. Who were the police of the 1890s of New York City? Well, looking at this guy, you might figure out that they often ate for free. They walked a beat and knew everyone in the precinct. The 3,800 man police force was 2/3 Irish. And the principal nationality they arrested was Irish. So you had Irish cops arresting Irish crooks. And more than half the arrests each year were for drunk or disorderly conduct. One of the biggest differences from today is that the New York police force in the 1890s, they actually slept together at the station house. 1/4 or almost 1,000 cops spent each night on reserve duty, sleeping at the precinct to be ready in case of riots. I mean, we forget, we see these armories. If you visit some of the major cities, you see these amazing structures that look like castles. And they were actually armories. The wealthy were very worried that the poor might rise up and attack. And there was anarchists then. And the whole idea was you didn't have telephone service. If you needed the cops in a hurry, if they weren't sleeping there, you couldn't get them. So amazingly, about 1,000 of them slept there. And that meant 50 hours a week was part of 48 hours was sleeping there. And if you did all the math, they did 110 hours. They were responsible for their job. I mean, they definitely saw their fellow officers more than they saw their wives. It was a dog's life, one crime reporter called it. And with all that time together, they truly bonded. Yes, there was definitely the blue wall of silence, but there was also hazing rituals like waking up rookies in the middle of the night, stripping them naked and painting them green. There were pranks like putting Limburger cheese in the guy's hat. There was one cop said he couldn't sit on the toilet and read a newspaper because someone would set it on fire. And they all had each other's back. The next image is of a very corrupt police officer who was booted off the force the year before Roosevelt arrived for not shutting down 50 brothels in his neighborhood, in his precinct. And he was fighting to get reinstated. And Roosevelt once said of this man, he represents all the Tammany evils that I warred against. And this is Captain William Big Bill Devery. He was born in New York. He was into an Irish family over his uncle's bar on 24th Street. And he was a bartender and briefly a boxer. He was he was funny. He once grabbed a reporter, Lincoln Steffens, the muckraker, by the shoulders, who was then exposing corruption. And he shook him and asked him, have you seen any stray graft running around that I might have missed? He called cross-dressers degenerates. He spoke in New Yorkese. When he ordered the patrolman not to drink on duty, he told him, standing up at the bar with them shiny buttons on don't look nice. By the way, I consulted on the Alienist, the TV show. I don't know if any of you watched it, but I tried to get that term degenerates in there. And when the actor delivered it, it was in the script, but when he delivered it, he said degenerates, so it didn't happen. But it was just to capture the sense of a police captain at the time. Anyhow, Devery was famous for the advice to rookie cops. He said, hear, see, say nothing. Eat, drink, pay nothing. And now to understand Roosevelt, you also have to understand the flip side of Devery, who was a do-gooder. This was Reverend Charles Parkhurst of the Society for the Prevention of Crime. And he was Devery's adversary. And they both fought for the soul of New York City. And Roosevelt came in to champion this man, Parkhurst's side. And Parkhurst hated Big Bill Devery. He said Devery had a certain genius, but it all ran along depraved lines. And Parkhurst dedicated himself to fighting police corruption. And he hired a private eye and took a tour of New York Vice, and he went after Devery for not closing those brothels. And the ensuing scandal led to the Lexow Committee hearings. So we've all heard of Serpico and the Knapp Commission, but Lexow was the granddaddy of them all. An expose of the rotten guts of the police department, such as was never witnessed in American history. Thuggery, shakedowns. Final report concluded every citizen was dominated by an overshadowing dread of the police department. So New York's finest, they already had that nickname, were being accused of being New York's filthiest. Enter Theodore Roosevelt on May 6, 1895, after the reformers finally won an election. Mayor William Strong appointed TR and the board, and the board promptly voted Roosevelt to be president of the Board of Police Commissioners. He was actually referred to sometimes as President Roosevelt in those days. On the left was TR's main booster, avid bicyclist Avery Andrews. Next to him is the wily lawyer Andrew Parker. And on the right is Ulysses Grant's son, Frederick Dent Grant, not considered the brightest man by some. Roosevelt would privately call him a muttonhead. Roosevelt hit the ground running, and the Reform Board was unified at first. Literally within days, TR developed a passionate agenda to root out corruption in the department and bring in smarter, more honest cops and change the culture from bullying to politeness. His energy was staggering. He let it be known that corrupt officers had better resign or they would be prosecuted. He wanted them out quickly. He vowed to establish civil service guidelines to get better recruits. He hired a woman stenographer to replace 2 men. You have no idea how staggering that was. The police headquarters was the most male place in the world. The only women in there were police widows who basically swept up. You know, there might be an occasional matron, but this was the most male bastion, and he had the nerve to hire a female. In effect, secretary was an important job, like his aide, his right hand, who was female, and replaced 2 men. So, and you can see, I love this picture, Roosevelt, you know, all the clutter on the floor. He was a whirlwind. He just, had no time to waste. He announced there would be harsher punishments for discipline infractions. Drinking on the job would mean immediate dismissal, and no pull from a politician could help a police officer in trouble. He wanted all promotions to be based on merit and bravery. He began telling reporters he wanted all the laws enforced. He said he wanted all police conduct rules enforced. The list goes on and on. He was trying to sweep out the dead, corrupt air out of 300 Mulberry, making snap decisions and pushing them through the board. Arthur Brisbane wrote an amazing front page piece for the New York World that ran on May 17, 1895. And by the way, the New York World was owned by Joseph Pulitzer. And at that time, it had 500,000 circulation when the New York Times could barely have like 10, 12,000, something like that. The World was the main paper. And this is what Brisbane wrote. We have a real police commissioner. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. Think what must be the poor policeman's feelings when he comes up for trial before a man like Roosevelt. Roosevelt speaks English accurately. He does not say, I done it or I seen it. He talks much more like a Boston man or an Englishman than like a New York police commissioner. Roosevelt's voice is the policeman's hardest trial. It is an exasperating voice, a sharp voice, a rasping voice. It is a voice that comes from the tips of his teeth and seems to say in its tones, what do you amount to anyway? In the good old days, the owner of such a voice as Roosevelt's would have been clubbed on general principles. Now the bravest policeman must listen to that voice, obey it, and seem to like it. The World and almost all the dailies in New York treated the new commissioner admiringly. And then Roosevelt, a month into the new job, did something unusual. And I think he did it out of genuine curiosity and wanting to do a good job, but it turned into a massive publicity stunt. TR and his good friend Jacob Reese began midnight rambles to check on the police force. The aristocrat police commissioner was willing to stay up all night to see if the cops were doing their job. And if they weren't, he was ready to get right in their face no matter how big they were. It definitely caught the city's attention and actually the nation's imagination. On one night, June 7th, TR and Reese went out prowling late. Their first problem was they had trouble finding any cops. Roosevelt grew disgusted. They walked on 2nd Avenue. They eventually found a policeman who was standing chatting with a pretty woman who was probably a street woman. Roosevelt, again disgusted, they lurked in the shadows, watched the man talk for a full 10 minutes until Roosevelt couldn't stand it anymore. He jumped in the conversation. "Officer, is this the way you attend to your duty?" And policeman Thomas Connors snapped back, "What are you looking for? Trouble? You see that street?" he said, pointing down 2nd Avenue. "Now run along or I'll fan you hard." And then Connors raised his nightstick, and Roosevelt introduced himself and said, "You will not fan me, and you will report to headquarters the following morning." So TR clearly relished a sport that included hunting and defying bullies. And he very quickly earned a reputation for waking up cops. Back then, it was said that policemen had a little bit of a sport that they used to play where they would, if a vagrant or a bum or whatever term is allowed to say, a hobo was sleeping on the street, on the sidewalk, I mean, they would try and wake him up by hitting perfectly on the bottom of both feet so that he would jump up and almost be running. If they got the blow perfectly on both feet, they claimed they could just, he'd straight running. So now, this is the tramps are in the background and they're imagining what it would be like for Roosevelt to wake up a sleeping cop, because cops used to have places where they had called a coop, where they would hide late at night and just kind of pass the night. So fanning the cop are the tramps' delight. So now 6 weeks into the job, TR, oh my God, plenty of momentum, popularity, goodwill, press acclaim, everything was going well for Teddy Roosevelt. And that's when he made a fateful decision to try and enforce the law against selling alcohol on Sundays in saloons. Fateful, disastrous, he chose to enforce a Sabbath blue law. It was technically illegal throughout New York State to sell alcohol on Sundays in saloons, but New York City had been ignoring that law for almost 40 years. Bar owners paid policemen to look the other way. Customers entered at a side door. Shades were pulled. Everybody, felt a little naughty, but barkeeps sold more booze on Sunday than any other day because Sunday was the only day off for the working man back then. They worked 6 days a week. So Sunday was their day in the bar. And New Yorkers definitely liked to drink. There were 10,000 saloons, from stale beer dives to swank corner taverns. There were cheap concert saloons with stages where people mangled popular songs and comics told rude jokes. I happen to have stumbled on one of these 1890s rude jokes, so I will, not super rude, but I will share it. She's a ballet dancer. First she dances on one leg, then on the other. Between the two, she makes a living. A glass of beer cost a nickel, a shot of whiskey cost a dime. Buy either one and you could enjoy the free lunch counter. So New Yorkers also had a tradition called rushing the growler, where they would send their kids to fetch a pail of beer from the corner saloon. This was especially popular on Sundays. So one union organizer said it kept daddy from getting drunk in the saloon and it kept the family together on the stoop. So good old New York family values, rushing the growler. So this is Avery Andrews. He wanted to emulate Roosevelt's midnight rambles, so he went out on Sunday and started seeing if any of the saloons were open. And he reported back to Roosevelt they were, who amazingly didn't really realize that this had been going on. And on many levels, it made sense, the decision they made. Come on, police, this would cut down on police corruption, and it would cut down on alcoholism. And Roosevelt had just lost his brother the previous year to alcoholism. I mean, it was the saddest thing. So it was very much on his mind. And when he did it, he went from popular public official to hated Puritan in a New York minute. Roosevelt was closing the bars on Sunday. And he didn't frame it as a crusade against liquor, but against selective enforcement and against corruption and blackmail. And over the coming months, he would say loudly and repeatedly, he didn't make the laws, he just enforced them. Enforcing laws was right, ignoring laws was wrong, black and white, good and evil. But many parched New Yorkers craving a beer on their only day off didn't care. New Yorkers became desperate for a Sunday drink. Some fled to Coney Island, which was part of the separate city of Brooklyn till 1898. And bartenders there eagerly served them beer and whiskey. And the cops of Brooklyn ignored it all. The excise law didn't bother us, and we didn't bother the excise law, explained one Surf Avenue sergeant. By July, Manhattan would be called Deserted Island and a Sahara. The New York Herald stationed reporters at the 30 ferry boat excursion lines. They found that 1/4 of the city departed. The multitudes went to places where the winds blow fresh and where it is no sin to drink a glass of beer. TR was sentencing working men to sober Sundays with their families on a day when the Sabbath law already forbade theater performances, attending baseball or football games, boxing, horse racing, circuses, even minstrels and acrobats. TR hoped for family picnics. Desperate times called for desperate measures. A Tammany Hall politician heard about a clever dodge, medicinal alcohol. So he said, go into a drugstore, ask for rainbow syrup. The clerk will deal you out about 3 fingers of the rottenest whiskey this side of Flatbush. It'll keep you walking when you get it. You're afraid if you lay down, you'll die. I knew a man that drank some of it, and he didn't do a thing but go over to Jersey City and stay all day. Thought he was having a good time, mind you. Well, when a man goes to New Jersey looking for fun, his mind is failing. Roosevelt had another problem as well. The dry Sundays fell along class lines. The rich could go to their private clubs, such as the Harvard Club. In addition to private clubs, the law also allowed hotels with liquor licenses to serve drinks on Sunday to guests eating a meal in the hotel restaurant or in their rooms. Poor people didn't stay at those hotels. Roosevelt was typically defiant. He repeatedly stated that he was merely enforcing the law and he would have been enforcing all the laws. It is true that I may never be heard of again, but I will have kept my oath of office. So the newspapers dug up every forgotten law. If he's enforcing the laws, well, let's have him enforce all of them. It was illegal to import oysters into New York City from May to September. Okay. Why hadn't he arrested the chef at Delmonico's? What about the law against flying kites south of 14th Street? And the New York World found it was illegal to have a deck of playing cards in a college or on a ship. The paper concluded the average citizen has been leading a life of crime. They just wouldn't let up. TR's police force was accused of being so overzealous that they were arresting innocent women as streetwalkers. Here's a cartoon of the Statue of Liberty being arrested for being an unaccompanied female out at night. A close friend of Roosevelt's, Dr. William Sturgis Bigelow, became deeply worried about him. Bigelow wrote Henry Cabot Lodge, Roosevelt looks worn and tired and has lost much of his natural snap and buoyancy. At this rate, it is only a question of time when he has a breakdown. And when he does, it will be a bad one. And then to make matters even worse, the Republicans would pass the Raines liquor law, and that would completely undermine Roosevelt Sundays. The new law had a loophole that allowed hotels to serve liquor with a meal 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just so long as the place had 10 bedrooms. So what do New York barkeeps do? They create 10 bedrooms. Here's Steve Brody. He's famous for jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge. He told reporters he had to convert a basement coal bin to get his 10th hotel room. Barkeep Andy Horn sent carpenters to his attic to carve 10 rooms, though in some only a midget could stand upright. But Tammany Hall building inspectors were ready to look the other way about all of it. Just after the Raines Law came in 1896, the New York World trumpeted, "Drinks all you want. 500 places sold liquor yesterday to the thirsty," and they were all called hotels. Most of them, however, were very backward about renting their rooms. By the following week, the World headline was, "Rum ruled the city," and a reporter gleefully announced, "The Tenderloin glistened with its brilliant evil. The East Side wallowed in beer." Some joints got around the meal requirement by serving the same sandwich over and over, just sat in the middle of the table. Playwright Eugene O'Neill mentioned seeing a, quote, mummified ham and cheese sandwich that not even the drunkenest yokel from the sticks would eat. A joke was making the rounds. Bartender shouts to the owner, "We got to stop serving liquor." Owner, "What, we run out of beer?" Bartender, "Nah, some idiot ate that last sandwich. They ain't another one on the whole East Side." So not unreasonably, Roosevelt expected the judges to have a sane interpretation of what a hotel meant, a meal meant, a guest meant. He announced the police will be vigorously on the lookout for fake hotels. But Tammany judges actually ruled 17 beers and 1 pretzel constituted a meal. Republican legislators had badly bungled the new law. So last call really turned into bottoms up and another round. New York really became the city that never sleeps right around now. So Roosevelt had certainly not created the Raines Law, but these events, especially with the demise of so-called Roosevelt Sundays, played out like a slap in the face of the commissioner. New Yorkers were drinking openly in fake hotels and fake clubs on Sundays, and also at 3 in the morning. And they were not only drinking, unmarried young women and shop girls, factory girls, who might never walk the blocks to a sleazy hotel, were starting to walk or stagger up those convenient barroom stairs to one of the 10 Raines Law rooms. Roosevelt, who for a year delighted in describing sober working men picnicking with their families on Sundays, was not amused by any of it, and he began secretly searching for a new job. TR would eventually alienate every newspaper, including the reform papers. He would alienate his own Republican Party. He would start feuding with 2 of his fellow commissioners. He would even try to fire his own handpicked police chief. You name it, it got ugly and very exciting. And he would battle Big Bill Devery in Tammany Hall. So ultimately, I would say, summing up Roosevelt, I mean, he went, as we know, he went on, Assistant Secretary of Navy and a glorious, glorious career. But I would say ultimately the job of police commissioner did as much for Roosevelt as Roosevelt did for the job. It was a noble effort at an impossible task. He introduced pistol practice, reintroduced the nightstick. He cleaned up elections. His 2 years there launched him onto the national stage. He honed his speaking skills. He even learned occasionally to silence himself so he could carry the Republican banner another day. He saw brutal poverty close up. While Roosevelt certainly earned a national reputation as a tough law and order reformer, some cities just refused to be reformed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zacks. Very interesting. So I'm sure we have some questions that we want to ask you. Richard, if you will stop sharing your screen so
Okay.
we can see you. And I'm going to start asking questions from the chat pod. If you're want to put a question in, go to the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, click on it and type in there. Make sure you're sending it to everyone. So let's start with a question from Margaret Griffin, who is an author also, and about TR. And her question is, in his autobiography, Theodore addressed his 2 years as police commissioner, but remembered some select things. What was the most important thing that TR left out in his autobiography?
That's a great question. TR actually painted himself as complete victor, absolute 100% victor as police commissioner. He hardly put any negative, he was very proud of his time, and it was kind of very good for him to paint it that way. He left out a ton of things. He left out how the Raines Law ultimately worked out. He left out that within a year of his leaving, Big Bill Devery would become the police chief and completely corrupt the city again. There were a lot of things left out, but he actually had a story that I wouldn't mind sharing if we have a second. There was a German named Hermann Alvart, who was a raging anti-Semite, and he came to rouse anti-Semitism in the United States. And Roosevelt, he was going to talk at Cooper Union, and Roosevelt had to decide how to handle this. And a lot of Jewish groups came and said, "You can't allow this man to speak." And Roosevelt said, "No, we have to let other voices be heard. But what I'm going to do is assign 20 Jewish officers to guard him and cover him." And so here Alvart spoke, but Jews were the ones who were protecting him and did a great job. And the whole Cooper Union speech was pretty much of a fiasco. So it worked out well for everyone. And Roosevelt included that in his autobiography. I'd love to tell that story.
Okay, our next question came from my brother David Owens, and it talks about the cover picture here on the book. And he talks about that this picture of TR in his office as police commissioner. If you see the larger one, there's a whole bunch of paper on the floor. Very
Right.
messy floor. Do you know about that? Comment or explanation on that?
Sure. I mean, Roosevelt was famous for being in an incredible hurry, and I just think it's wonderful to show his energy. You know, he had a secretary. He had I think her name Minnie Williams, and she was incredibly competent. But still, he chose to just work in a frenzy. He was always moving very fast. So that's how I'd explain that look. You know, and also I think there's a telephone there, which is actually unusual. People don't realize how difficult it was to reach other people back in 1895. There were very few private phones. The police precincts thought it was a great breakthrough to have a phone in each precinct. They still didn't have call boxes. When they wanted to alert a fellow officer of a problem, they literally banged their nightclubs, nightsticks down onto the pavement or onto the lampposts. It was just very primitive still.
Okay. Our next question comes from Jim Wallner, and that says, what became of TR's nemesis on the board, Parker? And let's
Sure.
see.
That's a good question. Parker was incredibly smart. I mean, he knew several foreign languages. He was he was a very successful lawyer. And he wound up being instrumental on the committee that unified New York, the consolidation of New York from just being basically Manhattan and a little piece of the Bronx into all 5 boroughs. Parker was instrumental on that. And he fades, to a large extent fades out of the picture. He's a little bit in philanthropy and some strange causes. He does not become a major player in politics. He was too difficult to work with.
Next from Terrence Brown, what was the transition of the commissioners committee to standalone commissioner? And he said that was a great Blue Bloods episode. So I'm not a Blue Bloods fan, so somebody may have to help us with that.
I was really flattered. Someone sent me a screenshot of, okay, help me out here. The star, incredibly handsome, Blue Bloods.
Tom Selleck?
Tom Selleck holding my book. So yeah, or book right behind him. Yeah, so that was very cool. So actually Roosevelt, New York, I don't know how the show, I never saw the episode, so I don't know if the show, usually Hollywood doesn't get it exactly right. So I totally forgive him because they gave me a plug. But he did not become the single commissioner. What happened in New York was pretty interesting. Big Bill Devery became the police chief, and he was so absolutely unbearable that they abolished the position of chief of police. The Republicans had no other way to get rid of him other than abolishing his job. So they abolished, so New York doesn't have a police chief, didn't have a police chief. And at the time, and then they had a commissioner, and so it just shifted from this was called a bipartisan board, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. It didn't work out. So they shifted to a single commissioner.
I'm going to take a point of privilege here. My show is The Alienist. I really like The Alienist. And so you've been serving as a consultant for that show?
I was the historical consultant on that show. Yeah, you can see, I was kind of thrilled to get into the credits, you know, it was like, yes. And then I also did Angel of Darkness, but for whatever mysterious reason, I got paid more money, but I did not get into the credits. I don't know why, but anyhow. But it was fun. I'm very proud. I can tell you a couple things that, you know, I was in the room, the writer's room, and I could honestly say I was the lowest ranking person in there. You know, the historical consultant does not get his or her way very often. But I tried, and I did get a few things. I got the opening scene where they're banging on the lampposts and you don't know what it's all about, and the sound echoes like jungle drums. Well, Cary Fukunaga was the director at the time, and he loved that idea. So he went for that. And then you eventually see the blood dripping from the bridge. And then the other thing that I'm proud of that I got in, I suggested the bathhouse scene. It wasn't actually in Caleb's book, that a place where a pedophile would most naturally hunt for new victims would be the bathhouses. And back then, boys under 16 were allowed to swim naked. So it would be an incredible opportunity for a pedophile, frankly. So we created the scene at the bathhouse. And I think that scene where he pulls the dead body and the blood slips on the tiles, and I think that's a powerful scene. So anyhow.
Definitely. This next question comes from Gene Coppelson. How much book research needed to be done in New York City, in person versus online? But you live in New York City, correct? Also,
I do. Yeah. Most of the research was done in New York, but the police, New York City Police, has not done well keeping their records. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. But I was able, there's John Jay has some criminal records. There was things in Boston through Massachusetts, that got you to Henry Cabot Lodge and some Roosevelt papers. There's things at the Library of Congress. My favorite thing in the research, I'll be completely honest, was online newspapers. New York World's not available everywhere, and Columbia University had every issue of the World, the Evening World, the Journal. Some of you might know that William Randolph Hearst was the new kid in the block running the Journal, which was competing with Pulitzer's World. These papers were so entertaining, and I'm not sure how accurate they were, but they were really entertaining, and it really helped me research the book. So.
Okay, and one more kind of comment and question from Rick Marshall. He says, you have taken a sarcastic tone about Roosevelt's efforts, and especially his fellow reformers. Little criticism of the corrupt police? Question. Was the futility of Roosevelt's performance amusing, or should we treat it that way?
That's a fair question. And I think about that. I think about how do you do municipal, police enforcement. I mean, I didn't mean to be snarky or smirky or whatever that came off like, but it was a very difficult situation. The city, I mean, look at things now. We are tending towards legalizing. Obviously, we can drink on Sundays, the first thing. There was a lot of urge among the people. We can go to baseball games. We can bet on horse races. We can play the lottery. Numbers is not illegal. I mean, frankly, now, with drugs, marijuana being legal, I mean, there's a huge tendency now in that direction. And I'm not sure, I don't stand in super harsh judgment of the police officers who made this decision to allow something that was technically illegal. I mean, I will own up to that. But on the other hand, I deeply admire Roosevelt for his effort. I don't think there was any way it could have succeeded at that time in New York City. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I apologize if it came off snarky. I'm pretty much amused by most things. So I try to be, and that's probably what you were hearing.
Okay, a final question to wrap us up here. So was Roosevelt's involvement, do you think, more about morality, opportunity, or financial?
Roosevelt's morality, opportunity. I would say morality. He really believed in these things. What I love about him is he was absolutely not one shred of a hypocrite. He was completely, he didn't stray on his wife. He didn't get drunk. He was complete straight shooter, and he attempted to do these things. I think it was mostly about principle and morality.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to let Dave Owens come back in and wrap us up, and we'll stop the recording then. And then if you want to hang around and visit for a few minutes with everybody, you're welcome to do that. We'll have a little social time.
Hey, hello, and everybody, come on camera, if you will, a little bit, and come on microphone. We need to express some appreciation to Richard Zacks. Pretty cool, huh? Wouldn't you say? I don't know, we've trying to get a tradition together of at the end of our Indiana meetings, we'll say bully. So anyway, on the countdown, let's give him a bully, a thumbs up, whatever you want to do, and we'll begin to end our meeting here. Hi, Amy. All right, so 3, 2, 1, yay, Richard Bully.
Bully. The weirdest part was doing this to silence.